2022 has been a remarkable year. I think in many ways it exceeded our expectations of what we thought this year was going to be. So let's talk about Limpopo National Park. What are some of the highlights, some of the things that stand out for you?
We had so many highlights in 2022, which is a fantastic thing to say, which is extremely positive to say, but it also is indicative that clearly we must be doing something right. If you think of all the resources and all the support being received across the board for people really trying to change the narrative around conservation and the future of that coexistence between people and nature. Now, Limpopo National Park is a good example of that, where we had in 2022 the second year, I'd say, of the full Herding for Health program being implemented. Now, Herding for Health is basically helping people to do what they've been doing for hundreds of years historically, and that is look after cattle on a 24/7 basis, but also herd cattle to areas where there are good grazing. Now, it seems simplistic, but the last 20, 30 years that practice has disappeared because there were no predators. But if you think about it, if you have somebody full-time walking with cattle and you move them constantly to new areas of grazing, it's a simple thing, it didn't happen. And that's Herding for Health. It's just it's a herding-based program. And then you add on the health of the cattle, the health of the environment, so it's this win-win-win. And in Limpopo Park, there's 6 communities that are now subscribing to the Herding for Health program. It's completely voluntary. People come to you, you explain the concept, and they said, we want to be part of that. 6 communities and about 17,000 cattle. And more or less 600 farmers that are part of the program now. We've seen this massive interest now of more and more communities because they can see the animals are healthy. They get much higher rates of fertility of the animals. They get more, a much healthier grazing regime, and suddenly they're getting better prices if they sell their cattle to the market. And all of these factors are good and positive. But it took away this animosity between the rangers protecting the wildlife and the communities living in the same space. And because the biggest source of conflict was predators, hyenas and lions. So to change that narrative and to have somebody by day with the cattle, and at night they're in these bomas, these enclosures, where they're completely protected. And again, there's no mortality. So for 2022, we've had 2 mortalities, which is significant if you think that 5 years ago they were losing on average 200-300 cattle per annum. Secondly, another highlight linked to it is what we've been busy with. And if I say it's a collective we, the Mozambican government, the ANAC, the Agency for Nature Conservation for the country, Peace Parks Foundation, the German Development Bank, many other donors, is to also provide livelihood support to people leaving the park on a voluntary basis. And this year was significant that a very large community called Bingu with 224 families moved from Limpopo Park to the buffer zone of Limpopo Park. And where they were, there was very, very little water. They were subsistence farmers, dependent on rainfall, which has become very erratic. And they were living in really, really bad living conditions. So these families moved now to their new homes. The World Bank and the German government and many people said this is probably one of the best programs that they've ever witnessed. And it was fantastic. I was there in person, and to see the people leaving the park, they were happy. They were waving at us, they were cheering.
And why is it important for communities to be uplifted in and around a conservation area?
Well, this is all about coexistence, and I think with climate change, we're going to see more and more pressure on the natural environment. Now, we need to move away from a fortress conservation mentality and systems, and we need to move in Africa, especially into a system where natural resource extraction can transition to being much more sustainable and much more environmentally friendly than it currently is. People living in the landscape often then see wildlife as a threat to their existence. So where you had a hard edge effect, now you say to communities, well, it's actually okay, you can in the areas of drought, you can move your animals into the wildlife area if there's surplus grazing. But with the herding fallow program, that might not be necessary in the future. But you keep the boundaries open, and also at the same time allow for animals to move out of the park into other protected areas and into bigger areas into areas where there's space. So getting that traditional migratory patterns restored is for us a critical part of having a landscape level conservation approach, a holistic approach to that, and to have interconnectivity between protected areas.
There's quite a practical link or a visible link between Limpopo National Park and Banhine National Park. You were involved in a collaring operation earlier this year. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we were flying in Banhine National Park, and the rangers said there's a massive herd of buffalo that has arrived there, and we assume that they arrived from Limpopo Park. Again, showing the importance of corridors. So clearly they needed to move for water or grazing pressure. That was a unique opportunity then to collar some of the buffalo and then to monitor their movements, because we don't know. One of the tools available to us to understand large landscape dynamics and animal movements is to collar animals and to then monitor their movement. And that tells us where corridors should be and where we should try and secure areas in between, that sit between core protected areas.
So obviously keeping parks like these afloat requires a lot of funding. And this year we've had some great support from new donors and recommitment from existing donors. Who are some of the people that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think what's probably a very big highlight for 2022 in Banhine National Park is to have the Common Foundation and the UBS Foundation on board. Now the Common Foundation has made a significant amount of funding available, and they are in it for the long haul, and they've made a commitment for the next 5 years with the UBS Foundation providing a matching fund to that. Banhine National Park is such a remote, isolated area, but at the same time this is probably one of the most important bird migratory parks in Africa. We have thousands of birds stop there, rest, and they're on this seasonal migration routes. It's like the mini Okavango Delta. So it's a park that, because of its remote location, will not in the short term, medium term, even 10, 15, 20 years maybe even, have a lot of tourists visiting and making enough money to protect such a large tract of land. And to protect this area, which is so vital and critical from an ecosystem services perspective, you need anchor donors. You need donors that say that we value this important, incredibly important part of the world. It needs protection, and for that it needs money. And what is interesting is, and what we've changed quite a bit, is if you look at our budget for the next 5 years for Banhine National Park, more money has been allocated to support livelihoods of communities than to support anti-poaching activities in the park. To see if one can really continue along this narrative of coexistence between people and wildlife, and to ensure that ecological connectivity in the long term.